in-depth, the whole range of aspects. I wish him good luck in 15 minutes to actually proceed with that. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Mona. Thank you to everyone here present. Yes, we're going to have a PowerPoint. Indeed, it's been said before, I think the amount of people in this oddly shaped room shows that there's an interest in this topic. And I've learned never to start your speech with a disclaimer, but obviously I'm going to have to do that. That it is impossible in 15 minutes to cover every single element of this, I think it's 60 pages long regulation. It is indeed a very interesting piece of legislation. So what I'm going to try and do is I will try and highlight some bits. I will first say a few general words about the process of the European Border Guard. It was already mentioned, the speed with which this was adopted. I will then say a few things about these innovations that we've heard about, and I think you can roughly divide them into regulatory, operational and supervisory roles that have all been either amended or added to. Then I would like to say a few words about what this European Border and Coast Guard does not, link it to the broader, what I would call border acquis. It's broader even than the Schengen acquis. And then a few words about the implementation. So this first slide, there's a lot of information there, but really what it is to show is that this European Border and Coast Guard is not an emergency measure. What it may do is it may provide for a permanent emergency measure, but the way this proposal was presented was this is to counter the refugee crisis. But if you look back into the history, we actually see that there is already a process leading up to this European Border and Coast Guard, and I would actually think it's safe to say that even this regulation is not the last step in this development. It all started with the Commission communication, which by then still spoke about a European Corps of Border Guards, and we've seen different notions throughout the past decade. There's been a number of studies looking into the conferral of executive powers on visiting border guards. We've had a study on the feasibility of a European system of border guards, which is actually not mentioned as such in the treaty. In the treaty we have an article on the gradual establishment of an integrated border management system for the European borders. This is actually the article that was inserted in the Lisbon Treaty and which forms the basis of this current regulation. But it would be wrong to say this is an emergency measure, I think. I think rather we see an evolution here. And then this slide is merely to show you indeed how quickly the European institutions have moved. I think it was 6 months until there was a political agreement and about 10 for the regulation to enter into force. And of course regulations once published enter into effect immediately, but they require quite a bit of implementing measures here. Good, so what are these innovations? I think that you see on the one hand a reinforcement of the regulatory and operational tasks that Frontex already had. We can still refer to the European Border and Coast Guard Agency as Frontex. I think that saves a lot of changing of logos, etc. But what we also see very importantly is an introduction of a supervisory role of the agency. And I think what is key is the inclusion in the regulation of a definition of what is a European integrated border management. We did have a political statement from 2006, but we now have this codified in a piece of legislation. And what does that definition do? It groups together existing fields of competence of the agency. So it refers, for instance, to financial solidarity. The agency already had a function under the former European External Borders Fund, now the Internal Security Fund Borders. It refers to databases. For instance, the Eurosur regulation gave powers to the agency. So these are now grouped together in this strategy. And it widens also the scope of action of the agency. If we look at this integrated border management definition, it broadens it substantively. We now see a specific mention to cross-border crime, to international protection, to search and rescue. And it also territorially broadens it. It refers now to technical and operational measures, not just at the borders, but also within the Schengen area. Some substantive reinforcements of the agency we see in the inclusion of the power to process personal data that used to be very, very limited under the Eurosur regulation. We see a reinforcement of its operational resources, so technical equipment and human resources. It can acquire its own equipment, which it already could, but this has been reinforced. There's now an equipment pool. Again, we always had the Krate. We already had a pool, but again, it's reinforced. The European border guard teams, they existed, but now there is much more of an obligation to make these actually available. And the same goes for the rapid reaction team, pool. We already had since 2007 these rapid border intervention teams, but now they actually have to be made available. A number of 1,500 border guards should be sort of this standing corps, this emergency corps, on-call border guards. And that number is halved when member states are faced themselves with an exceptional situation. So these exceptions, the possibility to invoke a problem at your own borders, that has been limited now under the new regulation. And also the provisions on the external dimension. So joint operations in third countries have actually been made possible now. And the sending of liaison officers, that was already possible since 2011, but will now also be reinforced. And lastly, return. A lot of focus on return. Good. What is so fundamental, I think, and this was already said in relation to the proposal by Philip de Broecker last year, Frontex becomes a bit of a line manager. There's a hierarchy introduced, I think, by this European border, by the regulation establishing the European Border and Coast Guard. Yes, there is shared management, but you clearly see that there is a supervisory role for the agency. It determines a European strategy, and national strategies must be in line therewith. It's a shared responsibility. There's a duty of good faith. Now, this is a general duty under EU law, but it's reinforced by emphasizing this in the regulation. And also the obligation to share all necessary information. This really puts a stronger control over national authorities, I would say. And this is reinforced also by the vulnerability assessment mechanism. In addition to what already existed, the Schengen evaluation mechanism, now Frontex is given a role in actually checking whether member states' capacities are up to standard. They do so by posting liaison officers in the member states who carry out a vulnerability assessment at least once a year, which can lead to recommendations by the executive director, and in case of non-compliance, to a decision of the management board. The management board where the representatives of the member states are represented. And in case of non-compliance, and this is very interesting, the Council and the Commission will be notified and action may be possible under Article 19. Bit of a cliffhanger, right? What is Article 19 then? Well, Article 19 applies in two situations. There is a situation where a member state does not comply with a management board decision that it should get its act together, or the member state faces a particular pressure and refuses to ask for help from the agency. And we've seen this, of course, during the situation last year. And if that is the case, the Council can actually draw up an implementing decision telling the member state what to do. This is sort of a watered-down version of that infamous right to intervene. And there you see very clear time limits. The executive director has to draw up an operational plan within 2 days. Within 3 days there should be agreement then. Within 5 days the first rapid reaction team should be sent. Within 7 days initial border guards could be sent. And finally technical equipment should be made available within 10 days. And if that doesn't work, then really we see something very interesting, because then there is a reference made to Article 29 of the Schengen Borders Code. And what does that say? That is the article that was inserted in 2011 after the Tunisian influx in Italy that says, in case of exceptional circumstances, where there are persistent serious deficiencies in the control of the external borders, we can suspend Schengen for a period for a maximum of 4 times 6 months. As a last resort, the Council may recommend that member states reintroduce checks at their internal borders. And this is actually what we've been seeing happening throughout Europe in 2015. Because the traditional traditional rules say you can, in case of a danger for public security, you can reinstate internal border checks, but that is only for a more limited period. So they have resorted to Article 29, and now there's an explicit link made between the powers of the agency and this Article 29. And I think it's very nice that a lot of the workshops today are actually going to discuss some of these issues, the hotspots, the role of the agencies more in general. But this leads to a lot of questions, I think, and I can only sort of point these out. What is the relationship between the integrated border management as defined in the regulation and the tasks of the agencies, which seem to be in a way much more limited? There's very few explicit mentioning of the powers of the agency, for instance, in cross-border crime. Who is in charge of the overarching integrated border management strategy? Because you would say that is a highly political decision to be taken by the institutions. Who adopts that? Is that the COSI, the Committee for Internal Security? Is there a role for the European Parliament there? And also, when we talk about shared responsibility, have we thought through the consequences that this will have for national administrations? The integrated border management, as defined in the regulation, covers a lot of different competences which are pertaining to a lot of different national administrations who will now have to work together and get their national strategy. First of all, have to get a national strategy and then get it in line with the European one. So what are the consequences for national administrations? And then the position of the agency itself. When studying agencies, we always talk about autonomy and accountability. Well, autonomy, what is the relation now of the agency in relation to the Commission? How is the agency going to take very politically sensitive decisions under high pressure from the member states? Accountability, it was mentioned, the issue of fundamental rights. There is now an individual complaints mechanism for people who feel that their rights have been infringed in border management operations. But as we will see, still there is no real solution for the question of who is responsible if something goes wrong. Is it the agency? Is it the union? Is it the member states? And what is the relationship between the agencies, between agencies such as Europol, EASO, FRA, Frontex? So what does the European Border Guard regulation does not do? It doesn't create a genuine integrated border and coast guard. Just to a large extent, this idea of a European border and coast guard is a legal fiction. It does not replace national border guards. It does not provide the agency with the right to intervene. Yes, there is a right to suspend Schengen, or at least a council recommendation to member states to reinstate internal border checks, but that is really if everything fails and a member state refuses to comply. It does not endow law enforcement powers on the agency. I think that is one of the fundamental points. These remain with the national authorities. It does not solve, as I said, the question of responsibility for fundamental rights violations. I would argue it does not provide for genuine solidarity either. Now, in relation to the broader acquis, and I apologize to the translators because I'm babbling on, the EC Border Guards Regulation, I think, to a large extent sets the norm. It creates a central role for Frontex in the hotspot approach and the migration management teams. And therefore also within the implementation of the EU-Turkey deal, which itself seems to have become a template for the EU's external relations. It also seems that the Frontex mold seems to be exemplary for what is also being proposed now with the EASO, the European Asylum Agency, including this vulnerability assessment mechanism and the possibility of ultimately suspending the European rules. In that case, not the Schengen rules, but the Dublin rules. Also, there's a very important link to, and I think it's important just to stress that European border management is high on the agenda also as a security issue. We see this in various Commission communications, in the internal security strategy of the European Union. There is a lot of focus on border security. Clear example there recently, for instance, is the proposal to have a European, what the Americans call the ESTA. In Europe it would be the European Travel Information and Authorization System, which also provides for a role for Frontex. The central unit would be with the agency, which I find very interesting, as you would think it would be more suitable to be with EULISA. I see I have 1 minute left. Well, how about the implementation then? And I'm going to speak faster as she starts looking more angry at me. The priorities that were established by the JHA Council were putting in place the rapid reaction pools, the vulnerability assessment, return, which is of course very topical also after the events in Berlin, establishing the complaint mechanism and a model agreement for operational activity in third countries. Now, there is a Commission communication which nicely tells us what has been achieved so far. And interesting, what you see is that some of the problems that caused the adoption of this regulation, lack of resources, lack of technical equipment, still continue to hamper the agency under its current network. What has been adopted is a common methodology for these vulnerability assessments and a network. Return pools remain under-equipped, there you see it again, but there is a lot of progress made in that area as well. The complaint mechanism has been established, and importantly they're now hiring staff, because there was for now only one fundamental rights officer in Frontex, and the Commission has adopted its model agreement. Good. Now, however, we still see internal border checks in place. We've heard the Commission representatives say how much border checks cost. We saw in the Back to Schengen communication of the Commission that we should go back to normality, whatever that may mean, as soon as possible. However, what we see is, sorry, I'm just going to quickly, we see, however, that internal border checks remain in place. The situation remains fragile, and what I find interesting here is that this Council decision, which recommends the keeping into place of internal border checks, is that it doesn't refer explicitly anymore to the, I'm almost done, I'm gonna, please don't. What is interesting is that the focus is no longer on the deficiencies in the external border management by the Greeks. One of the justifications mentioned in the Council decision is the regulation still needs implementing, and so does the EU-Turkey deal. And as we all know, the EU-Turkey deal is not really being implemented. Why? Because I think actually in order to avoid these kind of situations, it's not just implementing the border agency's regulation, it's also the resettlement of people from Turkey, the relocation mechanism, the sort of forgotten complements of the EU-Turkey deal. With that, I am going to hand the floor over to